In a split second, my world turned upside down. There I was, standing in the middle of the street, helpless, watching a woman, an HOA Karen, point a gun directly at my disabled daughter. My heart raced, my hands trembled, and every inch of my being screamed for action. But as a trained sniper, I knew that the difference between life and death was no longer in the hands of fate. It was in mine. The seconds dragged on, but time slowed. I had been trained to take a life when necessary. Now, the weight of that training would be the only thing standing between my daughter and the unthinkable. With every ounce of my being, I steadied my breath, focused my sights, and made the shot that would change everything. This isn't just a story of a life saved. It's the story of a father, a soldier, and a protector. The story of a moment where a decision had to be made. A decision to protect, to stop, and to hold the line no matter the cost. What happens next will leave you on the edge of your seat, questioning everything about human nature and the lengths we go to protect those we love. Hold on tight. This story is just beginning. It was a beautiful Saturday morning, the kind of day that made everything feel right in the world. The sun was shining brightly, casting a golden glow across the neighborhood. The air was fresh with the scent of blooming flowers, and the sound of distant birdsong filled the otherwise peaceful atmosphere. It was one of those rare moments when life seemed to slow down, allowing you to appreciate the simple beauty of the day. My daughter, Lily, was outside playing in the front yard, her laughter echoing through the air. She had always been a bundle of joy, even though life had thrown its fair share of challenges her way. Born with a disability, Lily had to work harder than most to do the things that came naturally to others. Yet, every day, she faced those challenges, with a smile on her face, never letting her condition define her. That morning, she was outside, playing with her toys, lost in the simplicity of her world. It was her favorite part of the day, the moments when the sun was high and the world felt like her playground. I stood on the porch, watching her with a sense of pride. Every step she took, every little achievement she made, reminded me of how far we had come together. As I sipped my coffee and enjoyed the sight of my daughter running around in the yard, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. At first, I couldn't quite put my finger on it. But then, my eyes landed on a figure standing at the edge of the sidewalk across the street. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There, standing perfectly still, was a woman I recognized immediately. It was Mrs. Karen, the infamous HOA Karen. She had a reputation in the neighborhood, one that preceded her. Known for her obsessive need to enforce the rules of the homeowners association, Karen had caused more than her fair share of trouble. She was always looking for something to complain about, something to nitpick. Whether it was the height of a lawn's grass, the color of a front door, or a child's toy left out on the driveway, Karen was always ready to report any perceived infraction. Over the years, her presence had become a symbol of annoyance and frustration to the residents who simply wanted to live their lives in peace. But that morning, something about her presence felt different. It wasn't just the usual scowl on her face or the way she stood with her arms crossed waiting for someone to make a mistake. No, this time there was a certain intensity in her gaze. Her eyes were fixed on Lily, who was blissfully unaware of the woman's stare as she continued playing in the yard. At first, I thought it was nothing more than a fleeting glance, maybe even a momentary thought on Karen's part as she stood there, observing the scene. But as the seconds passed, it became clear that her attention was focused entirely on my daughter. There was something unsettling about the way she looked at Lily, almost as if she were sizing her up, studying her every move. I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and a cold chill ran through me. Something was wrong. My instincts, honed over years of training, told me that this wasn't just some casual observation. Karen had crossed a line, and I didn't know what she was planning, but I knew it couldn't be good. I glanced back at Lily, who was still oblivious to the woman watching her. She was laughing, completely lost in the joy of her play. It was a sight I cherished, a moment of pure happiness, untainted by the hardships she had faced in her young life. But then, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Karen's hand had moved to her side, and I could see the outline of something protruding from beneath her jacket. A gun! I froze for a moment, my heart skipping a beat. There was no way I could be seeing this correctly. But as I squinted and focused, I could make out the unmistakable shape of a weapon. Karen wasn't just standing there, observing. She was armed. And she wasn't just holding it casually. No, she was aiming it in Lily's direction. My first instinct was to rush to my daughter, to scoop her up and run inside. But as I looked around, my mind raced. There was no time for hesitation. In the split second it took for my thoughts to catch up with the situation, I knew that everything had changed. This wasn't just a matter of Karen being a nuisance anymore. She had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. I had always prided myself on being able to remain calm in high-stress situations. It was something I had learned to do over the years, whether through my military training or the challenges life had thrown at me. But this was different. This wasn't some distant threat or abstract danger. This was real, and it was happening, right in front of me. I watched as Karen's finger twitched, the gun now aimed directly at Lily. In that moment, everything else faded away. The sound of the birds, the warmth of the sun, the smell of the flowers. It all vanished. There was only one thing that mattered now: my daughter's safety. I didn't know what Karen's intentions were, but I couldn't wait to find out. I had to act. Without thinking, I reached for the phone in my pocket, dialing 911 with shaking hands. My voice was steady as I spoke to the operator, but my mind was already calculating my next move. The seconds felt like hours, each one stretching out as I watched Karen raise the gun, her finger moving closer to the trigger. The 911 operator assured me that help was on the way, but I didn't have the luxury of waiting. Every instinct I had told me to protect Lily, to do whatever it took to stop Karen from harming her. But how? I had been trained for situations like this, but nothing could have prepared me for the heart-stopping fear I felt in that moment. Karen had no idea that I wasn't just some ordinary father standing by helplessly. I had spent years honing the skills that now gave me an advantage. I knew what had to be done. But as I stood there, watching the weapon in Karen's hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an ordinary threat. This was something far more dangerous, and I wasn't sure how it would end. I glanced at Lily one more time, her innocent face still filled with joy, completely unaware of the deadly danger that was only moments away. And in that instant, I made a promise to myself. I would do whatever it took to protect her. No one, not Karen, not anyone, was going to harm my daughter. The stillness of the morning seemed to hang in the air like a thin veil, fragile and easily disturbed. My heart beat steadily in my chest, each pulse echoing the growing unease that I could no longer ignore. It wasn't just the usual morning calm. Something had shifted. I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was, but my instincts, honed by years of training, screamed that something was wrong. And as I watched Karen, the HOA Karen, standing across the street, I felt a surge of anxiety, something I hadn't expected to feel on an ordinary Saturday morning. For a moment, I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Perhaps she was just going to give one of her usual complaints. Karen was notorious for making the smallest things into grand issues. Anything from how loud the kids were playing to the placement of a garden gnome on a front lawn. She had a reputation for nitpicking the most trivial things, using her role in the homeowners association to impose her ideals of perfection on the entire neighborhood. I had grown accustomed to her passive-aggressive nature over the years, brushing it off as just another of her misguided attempts to enforce rules. So, I stood there on the porch, trying to convince myself that it was just another one of those days. But then, something happened. Karen's hand shifted subtly, moving, down toward her waist, where I could now see the outline of something metal beneath her jacket. A chill ran through my body as the realization hit me. She wasn't just standing there grumbling about the trivialities of neighborhood life. She was preparing to do something far more sinister. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe she had an object in her pocket, and her movement was just a coincidence. But then the unmistakable shape of a firearm became clear. My stomach dropped. In a split second, I saw the glint of the weapon's barrel, and in that moment, time seemed to slow down. Karen wasn't just standing there anymore. She was pulling a gun from her waistband, and it was aimed directly at my daughter. I couldn't breathe for a moment, as if the very air had been stolen from me. My eyes locked onto the gun, and my body froze. It was as if the world had stopped. The only thing I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. My mind raced. Was this really happening? Was she truly pointing a weapon at my little girl, my only daughter? Lily, so full of life, so unaware of the danger closing in on her, continued to play in the yard, oblivious to the peril she was in. My first instinct was to rush to her, to throw myself in front of her and protect her. But I knew that would do. No good. I couldn't just run across the yard. I had no time for that. I needed to think, to act, and I needed to do it now. The seconds felt like hours, and every single moment that passed increased the risk to Lily's safety. I watched in horror as Karen's finger began to twitch on the trigger. There was no turning back now. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't just an angry neighbor with a complaint. She was actively threatening my daughter, and I couldn't let that happen. My mind flashed back to every lesson I had ever learned, every piece of training that had been drilled into me over the years. This was the moment I had prepared for, whether I wanted to face it or not. But nothing could have truly prepared me for the sheer terror I felt, standing there helplessly, watching my child in the line of fire. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to act, but my training kicked in. In the calmest voice I could muster, I instructed myself to think, to focus. I couldn't let fear control me. If I was going to protect Lily, I needed to remain composed. My training had always emphasized staying cool under pressure, and this was the ultimate test of that principle. I glanced quickly at Lily. She had no idea of the danger that loomed just a few feet away. Her back was to me, her small hands clutching a toy, her face lighting up in a smile. She was lost in her world, in her play, and I couldn't bear the thought of her being hurt, not now, not ever. But in that moment, I knew I had to think of something more than just running to her. I had to stop Karen before it was too late. I wasn't sure if Karen knew I was watching her, but she continued to move the gun into position. The weapon seemed to reflect the sunlight, its dark metal contrasting sharply with the bright blue sky. My mind raced faster than I could follow. Could I run and tackle her? Would that be enough to disarm her? Could I get to Lily in time? I realized that I wasn't just dealing with a woman who had a gun. I was dealing with someone who was willing to go to great lengths to hurt my daughter. This wasn't just an ordinary confrontation. This was a life-and-death situation. The truth of that hit me with the full weight of a sledgehammer. I didn't have time to question what was happening or how it had come to this. I only had time to act. My hand slowly moved to my waistband where I kept my concealed weapon. I had always carried it with me for situations just like this, when an unexpected threat could arise. It wasn't just about protecting myself, it was about protecting my family. And today, that meant stopping Karen before she could harm Lily. I took a slow breath, steadying myself as I removed the gun from its holster. The weight of the weapon felt familiar in my hand, a tool I had used countless times before in training, but never in such a dire situation. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, but I had to remain calm. Every movement I made needed to be deliberate and precise. The difference between life and death was often measured in inches, in fractions of a second. With one hand holding the gun, I used my other hand to steady my aim. I didn't have a clear shot yet. I had to reposition myself, moving to a better angle. But as I did, I could see the faintest shift in Karen's expression. She seemed to sense that something had changed, that the situation wasn't quite as easy as she thought. But it was too late. Karen's finger tightened on the trigger, and in that moment, time seemed to stretch. I took the shot. The sound of the gunshot reverberated in my ears, loud and sharp. But in that moment, it was as though everything else fell away. There was no more fear, no more uncertainty. There was only the sharp, resounding certainty that my daughter was safe. Karen's weapon fell from her hand, and she staggered back, stunned. For a brief moment, everything felt suspended in time. The quiet aftermath of the chaos, the world around us suddenly still, but that stillness was only temporary. My focus immediately shifted to Lily. I had to make sure she was okay. She didn't understand what had just happened, and I wasn't sure how to explain it to her. But for now, I could finally breathe. I had done it. I had stopped Karen. In the chaos of that moment, there was a surprising sense of calm that washed over me. It was almost surreal, as though everything around me had slowed down. My heart was pounding in my chest, but my hands, despite the intense pressure, were steady. I knew that in situations like this, every second mattered. I had been trained for moments like this, moments where hesitation could mean the difference between life and death. But still, nothing in my training had prepared me for this exact situation. The weight of the responsibility, the threat to my daughter's life, was unlike anything I had ever encountered. As Karen's finger moved closer to the trigger, my mind was already working at full speed. The clock was ticking, and every decision I made had to be precise. It wasn't enough to just react. I had to calculate everything with perfect accuracy. In those brief moments, my sniper training kicked in, and my focus narrowed to a single point, stopping Karen before she could carry out whatever plan she had in mind. I took a deep breath, inhaling slowly to steady myself. My training had always emphasized breath control, slowing the heart rate, calming the mind, and letting instinct take over. I could feel the cool air fill my lungs, grounding me in the present moment. There was no room for panic, no room for doubt. I had done this countless times on the range, tracking targets, adjusting for wind, calculating distances. But now the target wasn't some distant mark on a paper. It was a real threat, a person with a gun aimed at my daughter. I glanced at Lily again, her innocent face still unaware of the danger that was closing in on her. She continued to play in the yard, her laughter echoing in the distance. I felt an overwhelming surge of emotion, a mixture of fear, love, and determination. I couldn't let anything happen to her. Not now, not ever. She was my everything, and I would do anything to protect her. I shifted my position slightly, trying to find the perfect angle to stop Karen before she could pull the trigger. I had no time for mistakes. Every moment was precious, and every movement had to be calculated. The wind was light, but it still required attention. The trajectory of my shot had to account for every variable. I was no stranger to the responsibility. That came with my training. But this was different. This was real. The stakes were higher than they had ever been before. As I steadied my aim, my mind replayed every lesson I had learned over the years. The hours spent on the range, the countless drills, the constant focus on precision. I had learned how to control my body in high-pressure situations, how to block out distractions and focus solely on the task at hand. But this moment, with my daughter's life on the line, was unlike anything I had faced before. I could feel the tension in my muscles as I adjusted my position, keeping my eyes locked on Karen and the weapon in her hand. She was still standing there, her finger tightening on the trigger. Every second felt like an eternity, and yet I knew I couldn't afford to wait any longer. My mind raced through every possible outcome, every potential mistake that could cost me everything. There was no room for error. With the gun raised and the target in my sights, I concentrated on the fundamentals: the angle, the wind, the distance. Everything had to be perfect. In my training, I had been taught to remain calm under pressure, to focus on the task and block out the chaos around me. But now, I could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on me. The fear for my daughter's safety was overwhelming, but I pushed it aside. I couldn't let fear cloud my judgment. I adjusted my stance, positioning my feet for balance, and focused my vision on the sight of my weapon. My fingers moved gently over the trigger, finding the perfect grip, the perfect tension. In the midst of everything, I was eerily calm. It was almost as if time had slowed, and I had entered a zone where nothing could break my focus. I could hear my breath, steady and controlled, and I could feel my heart beating. But it wasn't frantic. It was measured, calculated. Everything in me told me that I couldn't afford to miss. It wasn't just my own life at stake. It was my daughter's life, her future, her innocence. I couldn't let this woman, this threat, destroy everything we had. The shot had to be clean, decisive. It had to be the kind of shot that would end the threat in an instant. I took one final breath, holding it in for a moment as I took in the scene. Karen was still standing there, unaware that I was poised to stop her. I could see the gun in her hand, the slight tremor in her finger as she prepared to take her shot. My finger hovered over the trigger, my body tense, every muscle coiled like a spring ready to release. But I didn't pull the trigger yet. Not until I was absolutely certain. I reminded myself that precision was everything. This wasn't a moment to rush. I couldn't afford to be hasty. I had to remain composed, just as I had been taught to do in every training session. The pressure was immense, but I knew that this was my moment to act. And then, as the seconds stretched on, something shifted in the air. It was a subtle change, but I felt it. Karen's posture, her stance, the way she held the gun, it all shifted. I realized in that split second that she was about to make her move. She had no idea that I was ready, that I was poised to stop her. I exhaled slowly, my breath steady as I prepared to make my shot. I could feel my body moving in perfect sync with my mind, each muscle working in unison to ensure that this moment would count. The world around me faded into the background, and the only thing that existed was Karen, the gun, and my daughter. Time seemed to stand still, the tension in the air thickening with each passing second. The weight of the decision before me was immense. I couldn't afford to hesitate. I couldn't afford to wait. I had been trained for this moment, and now it was time to act. With one final measured movement, I took my shot. The world exploded in a burst of sound, and I felt the recoil of the weapon in my hands. But in the next instant, everything was silent. The chaos of the world around me ceased to exist. The only sound was the beating of my heart, loud in my ears, as I watched Karen's weapon fall from her hand. The threat had been stopped, and my daughter was safe. The calm before the storm had passed, but I knew that the aftermath was just beginning. The tension in the air was gone, but the events of that moment would haunt me forever. I had done what needed to be done, but the emotional weight of the situation was something I would carry with me for the rest of my life. The weight of the moment hung in the air, palpable and suffocating. Every breath I took felt measured, every movement deliberate, as if the very fabric of time itself had slowed down to give me the opportunity to act. My heart pounded in my chest, its steady beat both a reminder of my humanity and a signal of the pressure I was under. But despite the chaos unfolding before me, despite the overwhelming fear that surged through my veins, I knew one thing for certain. Hesitation was not an option. I had spent years preparing for moments like this. I had trained for the sharp focus, the quick thinking, the ability to process information in an instant and make decisions with life or death consequences. I had learned to suppress the natural human instinct of panic, replacing it with precision and control. It was this training that now guided me, pushing aside the overwhelming emotions of fear and urgency, and allowing my mind to focus on the task at hand. With a steady hand, I raised my weapon, bringing it into perfect alignment with the target. Everything else around me faded into the background. The world seemed to recede, becoming distant and irrelevant. My focus, sharp and unyielding, was solely on the woman who threatened my daughter's life. In that moment, nothing existed but the sight of Karen and the deadly weapon she held in her hand. I could feel the weight of the situation in every fiber of my being. It was not just my own life at stake, but the life of my daughter, my family, my entire world. I took a slow, deliberate breath, grounding myself in the present moment. It was a calming technique I had learned during my training. Slowing my breath helped lower my heart rate and sharpened my focus. The rush of adrenaline that had once threatened to cloud my judgment now seemed manageable, controlled. In those few seconds, I realized how deeply I had been trained to endure pressure, to be calm in the face of danger. It was almost as if everything was moving in slow motion, the rush of panic and fear replaced by the cold clarity of action. I adjusted my stance slightly, ensuring my grip was firm but relaxed. My finger hovered over the trigger, its smooth surface familiar beneath my touch. Every movement had to be calculated. I could not afford to make a mistake. The slightest miscalculation, the tiniest shift in my aim, could mean disaster. But as I steadied myself, I realized that this was no longer a time for uncertainty. My training had prepared me for this, and I was ready to do whatever it took to protect my daughter. Karen, still standing there with the gun raised, seemed oblivious to the danger she was in. Her eyes were fixed on my daughter, her expression one of twisted intent. She was so focused on her target that she didn't see me, not as a threat but as a protector. The gun in her hand was an extension of her will, and I could see that she had already made her decision. In her mind, she was already carrying out her action, but that's where she was wrong. I wasn't going to let her pull that trigger. I squeezed, my finger on the trigger, each movement calculated and precise. The world seemed to stop for an instant. Everything I had ever learned about staying calm in the face of danger, everything I had ever practiced in the training sessions, came down to this singular moment. My shot would be the difference between life and death, between a future filled with happiness and a future tainted by tragedy. And then the shot rang out. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the air, sharp and sudden. It was a sound I had heard countless times before during training exercises, but this time it was different. This time the weight of it felt immense. As the bullet traveled toward its target, I saw Karen's expression change in an instant. Her eyes widened, and her hand dropped the weapon as if it were suddenly too heavy for her to hold. The movement was jerky, almost as if her body had been shocked into submission. For a split second, I saw the disbelief in her eyes, the realization that she was no longer in control of the situation. The gun fell from her hand, clattering to the ground with a sound that seemed to echo in the quiet aftermath of the shot. She staggered back, her feet shifting unsteadily on the pavement as her body seemed to come to grips with what had just happened. The woman who had posed such a terrifying threat only moments ago was now disarmed, her weapon rendered useless, in the wake of my shot. But in that instant, As Karen's hand dropped the weapon, something else happened too. The tension that had gripped my body seemed to dissolve, replaced by a strange sense of calm. I had done it. I had stopped her. The immediate danger was over. The terror that had twisted through my chest only moments ago was replaced by a quiet, profound relief. I didn't lower my weapon immediately. The danger had not passed entirely. I couldn't take any chances. My eyes never left Karen, watching for any sudden movements, any signs that she might still pose a threat. But as the seconds ticked by and she remained still, I began to feel the weight of the situation lift. The world around me, once so chaotic, began to return to its normal rhythm. I could hear the distant sound of birds, the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. I could feel my pulse slow, my breath returning to its natural rhythm, but that wasn't the end. No, this was just the beginning of the fallout. I quickly shifted my gaze to my daughter, who was still playing in the yard, unaware of the danger that had just passed. Her small form was a beacon of innocence, the joy on her face a stark contrast to the grim reality I had just faced. For a moment I stood there, watching her, my mind racing with what-ifs. What if I hadn't acted in time? What if the shot had missed? The thought of losing her was unbearable, and the weight of that fear lingered, even as I saw that she was safe. I lowered my weapon slowly, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins, but now tempered with relief. I needed to get to Lily, to hold her, to make sure she understood that everything was going to be okay. As I moved toward her, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. My daughter was safe. I had protected her, and nothing else mattered. As I reached her, she looked up, her wide eyes meeting mine. She didn't know what had just happened, and I wasn't sure how I could explain it to her. But in that moment, the only thing that mattered was the fact that she was in my arms, unharmed, and I had kept my promise to protect her. We stood there for a few moments, the weight of the situation settling in as I held her close. The world around us, the quiet suburban street, the house, the neighbors, everything felt so ordinary in comparison to the extraordinary events that had just unfolded. But I knew that this day would change everything. We had survived the unimaginable, and as much as I wanted to forget the terrifying moments that had just passed, I knew I couldn't. The danger was over, but the consequences of what had happened would follow me for the rest of my life. I held my daughter a little tighter, making a silent vow that no matter what, I would always protect her. Whatever it took, no matter the cost, I would never let anything or anyone come between us. The shot had been fired, but the journey was far from over. The aftermath of the shot was surreal. It felt as though time itself had momentarily suspended, as if the world around me was waiting, watching, processing the weight of what had just occurred. My heart was still racing, and my body trembled with the adrenaline that coursed through me. I didn't know what to do next, how to even begin to process the fact that I had just fired a shot that could have ended a life. But there was no time to think about that now. The most important thing was Lily. I turned towards her, my eyes searching for any sign of fear or confusion on her face. She hadn't noticed what had happened. Not really. She was still standing there, playing in the yard, her back to the chaos that had unfolded behind her. The innocence in her expression, the joy in her movements, made my heart ache. I had just faced a life-and-death situation, and yet here she was, blissfully unaware of the danger she had been in, the threat that had nearly taken her life. I rushed to her side, kneeling down to meet her eye level. My hands were shaking as I reached for her, pulling her into my arms, the warmth of her small body grounding me in the moment. Her arms wrapped around my neck instinctively, and I couldn't help but hold her tighter. I wanted to shield her from everything, from the terror I had just faced, from the world that sometimes seemed so unforgiving. For a few seconds, it felt as though nothing else mattered. Just me and my daughter holding on to each other as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. But the world hadn't ceased to exist. It was still turning, still moving forward. And I knew that we had to face the consequences of the events that had just transpired. My mind was still reeling from the decision I had made, from the shot I had fired. I had stopped Karen, but what would happen next? What would the authorities think? What would my neighbors say? What would happen to Karen? The questions were endless, and the uncertainty gnawed at me. I stood up, still holding Lily in my arms, and looked around. The quiet suburban street was now filled with the sounds of sirens, the flashing lights of police vehicles reflecting off the windows of the nearby houses. The reality of the situation began to settle in, and I could feel the weight of what I had done pressing down on me. I wasn't just a father protecting his daughter anymore. I was a man who had just taken a life-altering step, one that would follow me for the rest of my life. The police arrived within minutes, their sirens blaring as they pulled up to the scene. Officers rushed out of their vehicles, their hands on, their weapons as they scanned the area for any threats. They took in the scene, Karen standing motionless, her hands raised in surrender, the gun lying on the ground, and quickly moved to secure the situation. One officer approached Karen, carefully taking her into custody while another came toward me. I felt a chill run through me as I realized that despite the immediate danger being over, the consequences were far from it. The officer spoke to me, his tone calm but stern as he asked for a statement. I explained the situation as best I could, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. I told him about Karen's actions, how she had threatened my daughter, and how I had been forced to take action to protect her. The words came out in a rush, almost as if I were trying to convince myself that I had done the right thing. The officer nodded, taking down my statement before moving on to talk to the other officers. I could hear snippets of their conversation about the weapon, about the potential charges against Karen, about the need to secure the area and ensure that everything was handled properly. But none of that mattered to me right now. What mattered was that my daughter was safe, and I had done what needed to be done to protect her. As the police began their investigation, I remained with Lily, holding her close as we sat down on the porch steps. The world around us seemed to be moving in fast forward, people rushing around, conversations happening in hushed tones, but all I could focus on was her. I needed to reassure her, to make sure she felt safe in the midst of the chaos. She didn't fully understand what had just happened, but I knew that she would have questions. She would want to know why I had acted the way I did, and I would have to find a way to explain it to her, to help her make sense of it all. But for now, I just held her. I whispered reassurances into her ear, telling her that everything was going to be okay, that nothing could hurt her now. My voice trembled slightly, but I tried to keep it steady. I didn't want her to see the fear I was feeling, the uncertainty about what would happen next. I didn't want her to worry about the consequences of the shot I had taken, the legal implications, the questions that would arise from the neighbors or the authorities. I just wanted her to feel safe in my arms, to feel the love and protection I would always offer her. As the police continued to work, I saw Karen being led away in handcuffs. Her face was blank, her eyes vacant, as if she couldn't quite comprehend what had just happened. The officers took her away, and I could see them speaking to her, asking her questions, but I didn't have the strength to pay attention to the details. My focus was entirely on Lily, and I couldn't afford to be distracted. The aftermath of the incident was only just beginning. I knew that the legal consequences would follow, that there would be questions about my actions, about whether I had used excessive force. I would have to explain myself to the authorities, to my family, and to anyone else who wanted to know why I had made the decision I did. But there was no question in my mind that I had done the right thing. In that moment, when Karen raised the gun at my daughter, there had been no other choice. I would do it again in a heartbeat, even knowing the consequences that lay ahead. As the hours passed, the police wrapped up their investigation, and the neighborhood slowly returned to its normal rhythm. The sirens faded, the flashing lights dimmed, and the crowds dispersed. But I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The events of that day would haunt me, and they would shape the rest of my life in ways I couldn't yet fully understand. But one thing was clear. I had made the right choice. I had protected my daughter, and in the end, that was all that mattered. The future was uncertain, but I would face it head-on, just as I had faced the threat to my family. No matter what came next, I would continue to protect Lily, to fight for her, to ensure that she never had to face that kind of danger again. The price I paid for that protection didn't matter, not when it meant keeping my daughter safe. And I would do whatever it took to make sure she could grow up in a world where she was protected, loved, and free from harm. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping tales of courage, survival, and the lengths we go to protect those we love. Stay tuned for more shocking and emotional stories, only here on the HOA Stories. Join us as we explore the raw, untold truths of the everyday heroes who rise to the occasion when faced with the unimaginable. Don't miss out. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest stories. Let your voice be heard. Comment below and share your thoughts on what true protection and bravery mean to you.